I'm director of the Princeton Environmental Institute, and on behalf of all my colleagues in PEI, I want to welcome you back to our faculty seminar series. It's great to see all of you here. With our standing room only crowd, it's excellent. As most of you probably know, this is a somewhat unusual seminar series in that the speakers are always Princeton faculty. So you get to hear from your colleagues of all the great research that they're doing. And I think this semester will be no exception. As usual, we will have these, except for this month, we'll have them on the first Tuesday of each month. And the speakers for this semester will be after Corina today, Gabe Becky from Geosciences, Craig Arnold from Mechanical Aerospace Engineering, and our newest faculty member in PEI, Anu Ramaswamy, who also has a joint appointment as the inaugural director of the new Center for Global India. So her appointment is with PEI, with peers, and with CEE. So she'll be our fourth speaker. All right. Since it's the beginning of the semester, I have a couple of announcements before we get to the seminar today. First of all, I want to remind all of you, if you brought food in and anything else with you, please clean up after yourself so we don't have to clean up after you leave. Thank you. In terms of upcoming events, I want you to just be reminded that we continue our Environmental Humanities seminar series. Rob Nixon and others have been putting this together. It's really fantastic presentations. The first one will be September 26th, Wednesday of next week. PEI is co-sponsoring with our terrific partners in Brazil Lab and with peers a conference here that we're calling Amazonian Leapfrogging. And this is really a discussion that includes folks from Princeton and a number of people coming from Brazil to talk about the future of the Amazon. And this will be October 17th with a public event, and then we'll have a smaller conference on the 18th, the day following. So keep an eye out for that. And the third thing I wanted to mention is that, as some of you know, PEI is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. And as part of that, we are organizing a conference to celebrate the 25th. We're calling it the Princeton Environment Forum. You can find information on the webpage. The dates are October 24 and 25. This will be open to the public, so you're welcome to attend. And I did want to mention that we have a couple of flyers around if you want some information. You can pick them up on the way out. And among other things, as part of our planning for this, we are working with communications to put together a series of podcasts that we're calling All for Earth. And these are really meant to highlight and discuss some of the topics that we'll be discussing at the conference, at this Princeton Environment Forum. The first one is with Steve, and there are others that follow. So if you're interested, please take a listen to the podcast that we've already put in place and that continue to be put in place as we speak. All right, a bit of a long list of announcements, but let's get on to the seminar. I'm really happy that today's speaker is Corina Tarnita. Corina is a professor in EEB, and she also is a faculty affiliate at the Lewis Siegler Institute. Her degrees are in mathematics from Harvard, and she came to Princeton in the EEB department in 2013. Her research is broadly about the organization and emergent properties of complex adaptive systems. So in some sense, how relatively simple local rules can lead to really interesting emerging complex behavior within systems. She looks at these issues across a wide range of length and time scales. And much of her work is theoretical and mathematical, but she has very interesting connections with empirical data where the theory of the models is tested against actual observations across a number of natural systems in orbit. Corina is very much a She is a Sloan Fellow, having received the Sloan Fellowship in Computational and Evolutionary Molecular Biology. She's a Havli Frontiers in Science Fellow from the National Academy of Sciences. She's an early career award winner from the Ecological Society of America. And I think most recently, which is last year, she received the Phi Beta Kappa Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. She's sort of a classic, terrific Princeton faculty member doing great research and great teaching at the same time. So please join me in welcoming our good friend.
Thank you so much, Mike. Now I can skip my first slide because you already said all of this. It's really fun to give a talk for one's institution, and also weirdly nerve-wracking, maybe because it reminds me of my only other talk I gave here, which is my job talk. Let me just adjust the lighting. So yes, my lab and I study how nature organizes itself across a variety of scales and across a diversity of systems. And we try to understand, what are the mechanisms, what are the rules of putting together all these different systems, and how do those tie to the robustness of the system? So how, in the face of various internal or external stressors. Today I'm going to focus on the scale of ecosystems, and I have to say that that is the one that surprised me the most, that I ended up working on it, because I actually always assumed that ecosystems were dauntingly complex, and they are. But I started to get interested in them when I saw photos that looked like this. This is vegetation patterns seen from satellite imagery. These are regular gaps in vegetation in Mali. Here's a maze-like pattern in Niger. Here are some spots of vegetation, also fairly regularly distributed, called islands of fertility. Here's a famous one in the sense that it's one of the prettiest, and so people talk about it a lot. These are the fairy circles in the Namib Desert. They're basically gaps in otherwise a sea of grass. And so to me, it was mind-boggling that something as complicated as an ecosystem could, at least at a certain scale, lead to something that looks so beautifully simple. And I thought, well, if I ever am going to study at that scale, it's going to have to, this might give me an inroad into trying to understand at least some of the forces some of the rules and forces that shape ecosystems, trying to understand them via these beautiful emergent patterns. I should say, I'm not sure if Mike has a rule about this, but I'm very happy to take questions. So interrupt me if you feel like I'm going too fast over something. It helps me pace myself. So I try to approach this via two questions. One, I want to understand how these patterns form. What are the mechanisms that lead to such beautiful regularity? But I also want to understand whether they matter. So do we understand something just about the rules of assembly, or can they actually be used as indicators for something else in the ecosystem? Can they tell us something else bigger or broader about the ecosystem as a whole? Of course, patterns have fascinated us for a long time. We really, as humans, like to see regular, simple patterns, and we're very, very good at spotting them. And I guess animal coats are probably some of the earliest that have fascinated people. There's actually the earliest, or one of the earliest theoretical models that are helping to explain, or at least have proposed one way to explain how such patterns can arise, was proposed by Alan Turing. And his idea was really beautiful, really simple. He said, there has to be some sort of interplay between two different scales. There has to be two chemicals that one at a small scale activates itself, so it grows. So that's how you get a spot to grow. But at some point, that spot has to break. So something has to inhibit this diffusing, activating chemical at a certain distance. So he proposed that these patterns must come from some sort of feedback that occurs at two different scales. At a local, very local scale, you must have something positive, a positive feedback that reinforces the pattern. At a distance, something must inhibit the pattern, something must inhibit that growth to break it and allow the pattern to form. So the same kind of model, the same ideas were actually embraced or applied in ecology as we started to think about the patterns, quite early on, already in the 80s, as people started to think about the kinds of patterns that I showed. The idea would be that there must be some sort of positive feedback that occurs at a very small scale, a negative feedback, something inhibitory that happens at a longer scale, and that tapers off eventually to allow the next element of pattern to occur, and so on and so forth. So how exactly would this work? Well, if you are in a system where there are no plants, and it rains, and you have very dense soil, the water pools at the surface. It doesn't infiltrate very efficiently, and so it mostly evaporates. So you never really get a good amount of water in the top layers of soil where the plants would need to use it. If, on the other hand, you have a very sandy soil, water infiltrates really well and really quickly, and again you end up with this top layer of soil that doesn't have enough water. But if one plant manages to establish somehow, as that plant grows, its roots actually maintain a very moist habitat around them. And that creates a range of facilitation. It can be moisture, there can be other things that can be facilitating, there can be provide a little bit of shade in what otherwise is probably a scorching desert the way I have it here. And so there can be various mechanisms of facilitation on a certain range very near this plant. But as the plant, and so others can establish nearby. But as this clump of plants starts to do well, the idea is that it will require more and more resources, more and more water. So it'll spread its roots and attract all the water away from nearby regions. And that will create a range of inhibition. No plant that tries to establish around there will do well. It's a very competitive, very inhibitory area. But plants that are at a distance will be able to establish. And so that's in 1D a kind of a simplified cartoonish explanation of how we would expect to get these kinds of patterns. You'll get clumps of very similar sizes, and the distances between them are determined by the length of their roots. Of course, it's very simplified, but this is basically the gist of how these models work. If we actually put this into a simple model, the type of Turing type model, where we have rainfall, we have soil water, surface water, we have plants take up water, they grow, they facilitate the way I just described, and then they inhibit at a distance. This is how the output looks. I'm plotting here biomass on the y-axis. I'm plotting rainfall on the x-axis. So if we have a lot of rainfall, we have a lot of biomass. As I keep decreasing rainfall, we expect that biomass will decrease. But in these models, the prediction is that it will decrease by going through a series of these kinds of patterns. So you don't just lose biomass, you lose it in a way that produces these beautiful patterns. The first one you expect to see is gaps. Regular gaps, each one of those gaps is of the same size, and they all have all have 6 neighbors on average, equidistant neighbors. We keep decreasing precipitation. The next thing we should see in our system is that those gaps begin to stretch and stretch and stretch and form these maze-like patterns. We keep decreasing, those gaps stretch more and more until they break the vegetation into small patches that look like these islands of fertility that I showed earlier in Niger. Again, very regular. This is basically the negative of the gaps. So it's one spot has 6 equidistant neighbors. It's a hexagonal pattern. The very interesting other thing that these models show is that if we decrease it a little bit more, the precipitation, the very next thing we see is desert. So this is called a catastrophic collapse. As you keep decreasing the precipitation slowly, you don't actually slowly you lose vegetation until you get to 0. At some point, the whole system collapses and you lose all of the vegetation. If you ask, well, what happens if water recovers in this system? We can also answer that. The prediction is that you go through the same sequence of patterns, but you require more rainfall in order to recover the system than you had when you lost it all, when it catastrophically collapsed. And this is called the bistability region or a hysteresis cycle. So the very nice thing about this type of model is that it predicts that if the world works like this, then we have, as we lose rainfall in the system, we have a very predictable succession of patterns that the system will go through. If that's the case, then that's great because we can use those patterns as indicators of the state of that system. So basically, if we are in the spot-like pattern, we know that things are pretty bad. But if we are in the gap-like pattern, we know that that's fine. So in principle, if we had resources, but not enough resources for every place, and we had to divert them, this could tell us which systems are more in need. Now, it's particularly important that these models actually apply in dry lands, which cover about 40% of the surface of the globe, and they have about 38% of the population. And obviously, they are some of the more sensitive areas in terms of the various climatic changes that occur. So really, it would be great if we could use this as a tool. This is an overview of the last few decades. I got interested in this when Rob Pringle asked me what I think this pattern is. And I said, well, it looks like spots. They look pretty regular. I think I know of this theory that explains how these spots, yeah, he said, yeah, that's true, it might be, but here's the thing. Under every one of these spots, there's an actual little hill, okay? And I have some antelopes here for size, for scale. So they're pretty big. These are about 10, 15 meters diameter, and they're about 30, 40 meters apart. That hill is not just any hill. Inside that hill, there are termites. And it turns out that there's precisely one termite colony in there. Not several colonies that are friendly with each other, just one. Every single one of those spots of vegetation, you go and you find a termite colony. And I've always been fascinated with social insects because there are these amazing models of cooperation inside, but these seem to be really very solitary. Once they're there, their own little mound, that's it, and then the next one is 40 meters at a distance. So why would vegetation grow so thickly, and so well on termite mounds? It's not on all termite mounds. Certainly some of them look very much like the chimneys that we all know, like the cathedral mounds that we all know, but there are some that are covered with vegetation. And when they are covered with vegetation, the vegetation does very, very well. Why is that? Well, termites are actually very efficient degraders of matter. So they go out and they forage and they bring back plant material, litter, dung, and then in a really amazing symbiosis with a fungus, they can break that down. And when they do so, they release nutrients. And so there's an increase of nitrogen and phosphorus on the termite mounds. There's also, they do amazing engineering feats that I would love to have more time to talk about, but one of the great things that they do is that their soil is actually quite different from the surrounding soil. So they bring various microparticles from different depths, and so at least in some of the systems that we're interested in, they allow for much better water infiltration. So plants really have it very well on termite mounds. If termites let them be there, they all of a sudden have more nutrients and a better access to precipitation. So that would explain why we have those, and here are some actual data, not just cartoons, that shows that as you move away, there's higher moisture, and it decreases as you move away from the mound, and that the various nutrients are higher on the mound than off mound. But so then, what is going on with this pattern? One very simple explanation could be that there's some sort of underlying, geomorphological, something else, something happened there, and that creates the template. Turns out that that's not really the case. This is otherwise a very homogeneous system. One other explanation could be that the plants start to do well, the termites like it there, they seed their mound, and that boosts the plants, but that it's in fact the plants self-organizing in the way I just showed you with the Turing type explanation, and the termites just go there and reinforce that pattern. But a third explanation could be that the termites go there first, they create the pattern, and then the vegetation gets a boost because of the activity of the termite mound. So it's not the plants after all, they're just following a pattern that's determined by the termites. So I'm going to try to untangle between these two. And one insight into what might be going on. So why would termites create this pattern if they were to create this pattern? Well, it turns out that even though termites are very cooperative inside a colony, they're actually extremely competitive with other termites. So they fight for resources. Here's a control experiment where we put in the lab termites from the same colony. We just want to see how they hang out with each other in the lab. They're pretty relaxed. We have some workers, some soldiers. This is a bit sped up, so otherwise it's quite boring. They mainly just blindly walk about in dirt, and when they run into each other, they just say hi. There is a little bit of assessment when they run into each other, but that's fairly quick. So here's a soldier and two soldiers actually. They spend a bit of time with each other, but then they go about their own way. Now here's what happens if you put termites from two different colonies. It's the same species, mind you, they're neighbors. This is real time, so all of a sudden it's sped up, actually, not by us, but by them. They seem more stressed. And there's this kind of weird headbutting that you'll see every once in a while. That's a soldier trying to decapitate other termites. So they're very, very antagonistic with termites from other colonies. Okay. And this is a sign of very strong competition for resources. They're really fun to watch. I know. There's especially this headbutting thing. So the question is, how does this antagonism actually plays out and affects the layout of colonies if you look at the landscape scale? Well, here's a simple model. We have a colony growing. This is the mound. This is the hill. But the mound is just not by itself. The termites have to go out and forage for resources. So the boundary here will show you their foraging area. That's their territory. That's as far as they span outside of the mound. At first, we have only one mound in this otherwise pristine landscape. They're very happily growing. They're reproducing. So at some point during the year, they release kings and queens that mate and start their own colonies, and slowly by slowly this landscape will start to fill out. When that does, it's going to get crowded there, and so there are fewer and fewer resources, so this antagonism starts to play out. And the simple rules that we use, and that you'll see here, the two arrows, there will be one more colony arising up here. So that one disappeared, but this one got to grow. The very simple rules that we use here are that if you are bigger, you can kick out a smaller one. You can just, in principle, the way social insects fight is that they do these wars of attrition. It's really quite, they have these epic fights where they more or less just obliterate smaller colonies. And so we assume, so one rule that we implement to capture that is that if we have two colonies that run into each other, if one is much bigger than the other, then the bigger wins and the smaller one dies. If they're roughly of the same size, however, they can coexist. And this is consistent with what people know from social insects in general. So again, they have these very big wars. They fight to death, unless they are roughly of the same sizes, in which case you have kind of a border establishing, and there's conflict and skirmishes of the border, but no one can really gain any ground on the other because they're basically pretty equally matched. Once we put that in there, we can look at the dynamics of the system. I showed you these very static photos, but we're actually thinking about a very dynamical system. These termites always put out kings and queens. They always try to seed new colonies. We don't really see that actively as we see it in this simulation, but this is constantly happening. Big colonies, unless they are killed by bigger neighbors, they actually live for quite a long time. When they die, you get these pockets that get filled by new ones that are trying to occupy that area, and then there's conflict, there's competition, and at some point one winner takes over. But the model is very dynamical, that continuously happens. What eventually stabilizes is the size of the territories. So you end up with territories of basically the same size. And that makes a lot of sense, because if you're smaller, at some point you're going to get killed by a bigger neighbor, right? So, to me at least, how many people here see this as think that this is regular? I mean, if you squint and you're very kind to me, right? I was very disappointed when I saw this, right? I was like, oh my God, this does not look at all like the regular pattern that I was expecting to get, until I realized that we see here something that we can't see in the photos that I showed you. And that's the territory boundaries. I have no idea how far termites forage in the real world. I don't get to see that. All I get to see are these blue dots, basically. So what if I just strip away the boundaries and then try to look at just the dots, right? Things start to look a little bit cleaner. So then I can actually compare these two types of pictures, and there are many ways to analyze point patterns, and I'll show you the one that's friendliest for this kind of presentation. So one way to do it is to look at a Voronoi diagram, and so count the number of neighbors and look at the distribution of numbers of neighbors. So I put a line in between two neighbors that separates the points that are closest to the upper one from the points that are closest to the lower one. And I do that, I pick a focal one, and I do that for all of its neighbors, and I do that for their neighbors, and so on and so forth. And then doing that and covering the whole, and I do that the same with the simulation results, with many simulation results. And then I can analyze how many neighbors do these mounds have on average. And so here's how it looks like. The model is in red, the random model, so if we just throw mounds on the landscape randomly, is in black. And then here we have various ants and termites from a bunch of different places. This kind of competition for resources leads to a distribution that is very much dominated by 6 neighbors. Okay. It has 6 neighbors on average, but also the majority of mounds have 6 neighbors as the distribution is normal around the 6 neighbors. So, all right. So in principle, with this very simple competition rules, you kill anything that's smaller, and therefore we are left with mounds of the same sizes. We can explain how termites could have created this pattern themselves, but I still haven't told you whether they did or whether the vegetation was there first and then the termites occupied. So I'm yet to convince you of which one might be the first one to initiate the actual pattern. But in principle, termites could create this pattern. This is all I've wanted to show so far. Question is, if the termites were to initiate this pattern, what would that tell us about the ecosystem, the robustness of the ecosystem? So if we look at it in exactly the same way as we did, and we said, okay, these are spots of vegetation according to the Turing type models. If this is created by vegetation self-organizing, then this is a system in danger of collapse. That's bad. But what if what if these spots are formed by termites? What does that tell us about the health of the ecosystem? So we took the same model and we said, these two things don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. You might have vegetation self-organizing in the system, and you might also have termites self-organizing in the system. What would the world look like then? And they might do this self-organization at very different scales. So what we said is, let's take the exact same model as before, but now when we are on a termite mound, we're going to say that plants are doing better, in the sense that all of a sudden they're better able to use the nutrients and better access to water. If we do that, this is how it looks, okay? So this is how the world looks. We get the termite mounds light up. They're very, very green, very much like the photos. And there is some sort of something happening in between the termite mounds as well, doing not as green as here, but still some green vegetation. And interestingly, you can also look at this across the entire, spanning all the seasons. So here's rainfall data from Impala Research Center, where we actually do a lot of this work, trying to parameterize these models. So here's how it's a termite mound. Here's what you see as we go through the actual pattern of rainfall. So when we have a lot of rainfall, everything is green, but the mound is greener. But when we get to the dry season, you actually get a lot of dead biomass around the mound, and have only the mound be green throughout, or have live biomass during the dry parts of the year. And so again, a very dynamical, not at all a static system. This is an interesting prediction because I showed you this photo at the beginning. This turns out to be a photo that was taken in the wet season. And so we looked at the same place during the dry season, and it looks like this. So very much like the prediction of the model, the spots remain green, though a little bit less green. And in between them, things start to look brown. As we keep zooming in the model, we find that in between the termite mounds, the prediction is that there should also be some sort of organization, a little bit of emergent pattern, a little bit of regularity. It's not as regular as the big mounds that I showed you, but it's still fairly regular. But this would occur at the scale of centimeters. So whereas the mounds are 5 to 10 meters diameter, spaced 30, 40, 50 meters apart, this would be at the scale of 20, 30 centimeters. And so I found this puzzling. When I saw this, I was actually quite surprised. Surprised, I should just say, a little bit stressed, because I realized I had never seen this kind of pattern as I was walking by termite mounds at Impala, and I thought, how could I have missed this? If the pattern is there, and the model tells me that the pattern is there, how did I not see it? It turns out that grass in the savanna is tall. And when you have tall grass that moves, left and right, you're not going to see the soil very easily. So it's really very hard, actually, to see what's bare soil and what's grass. We got really lucky, and there was an area where for the first time someone decided to burn it just to see how, just study the effects of fire. So this is the first burn. When you do that and you get rid of all the dry biomass, you start to actually see that there is soil. It's not just a sea of grass. There is some soil in between those clumps of grass. So we could take many photos of this, and then go to the same time of year. This was done in January. Go to the same time of year in the model that was parameterized using the rainfall from Impala, and try to compare them. We used Fourier transform analyses, and so we took photos like this and turned them into this and compared them to model excerpts like this. And we find that there is a surprising agreement between the model prediction and the little patterns that we were able to find. So the patterns were actually there. This was really nice because this does two things. It tells us that, so the small pattern in between the mounds in the model arises from self-organization. It's the Turing type pattern. The big pattern is the one formed by termites. A simple Turing model, like the one I discussed at the beginning, can't produce with one type of feedback, can't produce two patterns at two different scales. Because in the actual system we found those two patterns, it seems to me a really good indication that actually two mechanisms have to be at play. And a parsimonious explanation, given that we have the termites there, is that the vegetation does self-organize, but at a very small scale in between the termite mounds, and that the big spots that we see are actually driven by termites self-organizing in response to competition for resources and then driving the vegetation, boosting the growth of vegetation. So if that's true, and we're still, this was one indication that this could be true, but we're still obviously doing a lot of current work trying to play with this and figure out various ways to test it. But still, what would this tell us about the robustness of this ecosystem, if this were true? So here I'm focused on one termite mound, so you can also see the pattern that emerges. It's the same vegetation biomass on the y-axis, rainfall on the x-axis. As I keep decreasing, we start to lose vegetation, so same story as before. And you'll notice that by and large, in between the termite mounds, we see the patterns. It will be exactly the patterns that you expect based on what I showed at the beginning. There's a little bit of nice transition here where you start to see some rings and other things. But in principle, these will be the gaps, followed by labyrinths, followed by spots of vegetation. So here we have big spots of termite mounds and little spots of vegetation self-organizing in between them. The really interesting thing is that when you keep doing this, so now we're at a place where the system would have collapsed before, catastrophically to desert. But with the termite mounds there, it actually just loses a little bit of biomass. But the termite mound is still there because it's wetter. So even if you decrease rainfall, the plants still have more available rainfall than the plants that would have been here in the matrix. Eventually, if you keep decreasing rainfall, you will have a collapse to desert. But with termites, you have it much later, and it's less catastrophic, meaning that you really have a lot more of a warning sign. You don't lose all of your vegetation when you're up here. It's still quite a bit of biomass, but all of a sudden it's gone in the next step. You actually, it slowly or decreases in the system. If we try to bring back and see what happens if we increase rainfall, we get the same thing as before. We go through the same patterns. We have now two bistability regions. But notice that the most important one, the one that tells me, when am I actually recovering some vegetation in this system, is much narrower. So termite mounds not only slow down the collapse of the system, but they also help bring it back in a more efficient way. So you need not that much of a difference in precipitation in order to get it back. So this is just for comparison, the no mounds that I showed earlier, and this is a system with the mounds. And the bottom line would be that mounds increase the robustness of the system, both the resilience of the system to various stressors and the recovery. To conclude, I do have a few more slides afterwards, but just the bottom line, the way I think about patterns right now, I think they can matter. I think they can actually tell us something about the system. And so they can tell us something possibly about the health of the system, but they can also possibly inspire us to engineer solutions. If the termites are doing something and we can understand what the termites are doing and that's increasing the robustness of the system, can we replicate that? And I'll show you a little bit of preliminary results that we have on something of that sort. But I also want to stress that mechanisms matter. Just because we see spots, that doesn't mean that we know exactly what the mechanism is. Multiple mechanisms can lead to the exact same pattern. Basically, statistically, we can't tell the difference between the spots that are the result of termite mounds and the spots that are the result of plant self-organization. But clearly, one mechanism leads to a system with spots that's in danger of collapse. One mechanism leads to a system with spots that may actually be very robust. So it's very, very important to understand the mechanisms. And multiple mechanisms can actually co-occur and give you these really nice nested patterns at multiple scales. And once we get to multiple patterns and multiple mechanisms, that may actually help us untangle which mechanisms are acting at which scale. Now, we're doing a bunch of different current projects. One of the greatest weaknesses of this theory in general is that it hasn't really been tested much. It's very hard to test it. The patterns that I showed you, the vegetation patterns that I showed you, occur on these enormous scales. And they probably took, hundreds of years to self-organize at that scale. So it's very hard to say, we go there to test these models. You'd have to create a huge disturbance and wait for it and see how the pattern reassembles itself. It's hard. But finding these patterns at much smaller scales and having one system in which we can tinker actually has helped us learn a lot about how to parameterize these models in a particular system and try to test them at a much, much smaller scale. It's not easy at all. Manipulating rainfall turns out to be a very hard thing, because you're manipulating all sorts of other things in the process. But we've certainly learned a bunch of different things from it, and we're continuing to see how we can parameterize and better test these models. We're also doing more on the termite front, trying to understand, what exactly are they competing for? What are they eating? I showed you some of the behavioral work that we did looking at the competition, but what are they really competing for? So we're using DNA metabarcoding to analyze what they eat and see what different within the same species, but also different species, what kind of resources they might be competing for. And we're trying to look at the effects of resource availability and so on to try to understand what controls the patterns of the termites. One of the ones that we're very excited about recently is one that tests both the ecosystem level consequences of the pattern and tells us something about being able to engineer solutions. So one of the things we did, and I'll go a little bit more in depth here, is pick areas, and this is an NDVI image. The more pink it is, the more green it is in the actual world. And so what we did, we wanted to do, so one of the things we really wanted to test is, does it matter that these mounds are clearly doing a lot by being in the system. They can form these refugia for vegetation. They boost productivity by boosting the growth of the vegetation. But does it matter that they are in this hexagonal type pattern? Or could they just be random? Could they just be in a square-like pattern? Does it matter that they are in a hexagonal pattern? So what we did is to try to form our own termite mounds. So we picked circles. This is 10 meters diameter, each one of them. And we arranged some of them in a hexagonal pattern. And what we did is we added nutrients in each one of those. NPK, try to see what happens in time. Next to it, we picked a plot where we created random patterns of such circles. And we wanted to see, do we see any kind of effects at the broad pattern scale that tell us that it's better for mounds to be hexagonally distributed, better for the whole system that the mounds are hexagonally distributed than if they were just randomly in the system. It turns out, just very preliminarily, if we look at how much animals prefer to eat within these circles, they much more prefer and spend much more time in this area. And I have no idea why this is. I don't know if animals are figuring out that because it's a regular pattern, they have a simpler way of getting from one to the other. But just based on dung counts, which give us a sense of how much time do animals spend in any particular region, they certainly utilize the hexagonal pattern of these otherwise very nutritious areas much more than they utilize this one. So there may be some actual interesting synergistic effect of having all of these mounds there at once. And this kind of work we're hoping might give us some insight into, can we actually engineer some of these, can we actually reproduce some of the effects of the termite mounds and boost various ecosystem functions. Once we've started to play around with water and nutrients and manipulate those experimentally, we started to also look at what happens to other, what other consequences there are in the system at various scales. So here I told you about a consequence on animal movement, so at a pretty large scale, but we're also looking at a much smaller scale and trying to understand what consequences this kind of pattern has for soil microbial communities. And finally, one that we're just starting to think about, we also do some work in Mozambique, in Gorongosa National Park, and there are very frequent burns of the savanna. And one thing we see is that the termite mounds don't burn. They're more wet, and they actually allow vegetation that's more forest-like to grow on the mounds. And so you go through these areas that are otherwise completely burned, except for the mounds that are perfectly green and unaffected by the fire. This leads to a very interesting hypothesis that maybe termite mounds can actually mediate the coexistence of two types of vegetation, forest-like and savanna-like, in areas where otherwise we might get some of these alternative stable states that everyone talks about. It could either get stuck in a savanna-type pattern, or in a savanna type, or in a forest type. And so that's the interaction of this pattern with fire is one of the things that we're interested in studying. And finally, one of the current projects that I'm maybe most excited about is that all the patterns that I showed you, they're really beautiful, but they're very serendipitously found. Someone, me, bored mostly, finding, playing too much with Google Earth, trying to find, new patterns. And so, you find that someone else finds a pattern and they write a paper and it's like, oh, we found one more of this kind of pattern in Australia. And so we started to wonder, can we actually do this systematically? Like really look at the globe and produce a pattern, a map of the patterns. Can we actually tell how much pattern there is out there and then categorize it somehow and then try to get to the bottom of, testing models and mechanisms and so on. And so we're taking different kinds of patterns and we're trying to come up with a signature. Here's a simple one using Fourier transforms that differentiates these two different kinds of patterns, and then try to scan the globe and use all of this amazing publicly available satellite imagery. And then here the maroon on this map just tells me we found something here. We use machine learning algorithms that basically light up every time they think they see a pattern that looks like this. And then we go in there and we see, what kind of pattern are we seeing? And so I'm excited about that, not only because it'll save us this, we kind of have to get lucky to get the next pattern, but it might also we might be able to ask questions about how much pattern is there? Is it a lot? Is it a little? It's much more than I would have expected. I find it mind-boggling that you can find such simple and elegant patterns, again, emerging in these complicated systems. But still, is there an intelligent way of asking a question about how much pattern should we expect, and can that help us a little bit better understand some of the things that I talked about earlier? So with that, I'll thank my funding and my collaborators. And I will leave you with a video that's trying to reproduce the fairy circles, for which the termites are also a candidate explanation, with a very nice natural history bit that here, these are gaps of vegetation, but they're supposed to also be associated with the termites. So here, the termites are not very good for the vegetation on top of or very much in the surrounding of their mounds. Why is that? Well, this particular species drinks water from the soil. They need to put their mouth parts against soil capillaries and extract the water that way. So the plants are their main competitors for water. And so they actually kill plants on in some little pond around them, near their mound, and create something like a well. So basically this soil in here is a lot more moist all throughout the year, and termites can have access to that water. And so I'll show you a video up there starting with one termite. And again, we have precipitation here, so you get to see this is the actual dynamics of the termites. This is the dynamics of termites with vegetation. By the time I take questions, hopefully that video will start to look like this. It usually does. Thank you. Yeah, there's one up back there.
Thanks for your talk. Really interesting. I was curious, is there a role at all of disturbance by invasive species in changing the observed patterns of vegetation?
Is there a role of invasive species in the patterns, in disturbing the patterns that it's a really good question. One of the things that I didn't really get to talk about is that these models assume so much simplicity, right? So they're usually one type of vegetation, maybe two types, right? Once you start to throw in more types of vegetation, it gets harder and harder to see this kind of regularity, right? So any kind of heterogeneity, underlying heterogeneity, will start to mess with the pattern. And, you know, it'll mess with the pattern in the sense that it might not emerge from the beginning, or it might mess with it by destroying it if they come in and they, you know, let's say some termite species that outcompetes, you know, the existing one, that one might also create its own pattern, but you'd certainly notice a period where they're just quite disturbed. Yeah, so that's an important point. Mike.
Incredibly interesting. I was wondering, just two questions. One is that the regular hexagonal pattern that you set up, are you considering testing the level to which animals are tolerant to random pattern? Is there a point at which they're tolerant that they...
Oh, yeah.
And then at some point they just very neophobic and don't approach it. And the other is, are you looking at patterns in urban areas as well?
Oh, yeah. That's such a, yes. So I'll start with the urban areas just because I love that one so much. It's, we've been looking at this, right? So how much pattern do we see when we look at human systems? It turns out if we build a system, we are obsessed with right angles. And so if we really plan it, it all looks like Manhattan, you know? But if we let it emerge, so often, so if there's less central planning and more kind of self-organization, you might actually see this kind of pattern. So in the Great China Plateau, actually, if you start to look at the cities and you look and you filter them, so you can actually go and do this. You filter them by size and you look at the biggest cities first. It's too few of them, but you see that they're actually pretty equidistant and roughly of the same size because that's how you filtered them. Then you look at the next level of population, and then you start to see that those are interspersed very regularly, very hexagonally in between the big ones. And then you look at the next level, and it even holds true there. And so I actually don't know the history of China, embarrassingly, you know, well enough to know. But I wonder if they were some sort of city-states that fought with each other for various resources, and then they ended up just pushing, and so it's the big city, and then everything that's surrounding them does the same thing. I don't really know, but it would be really cool if pattern could give us an insight, you know, into history, for example, like some historical insight. The thing about the so yes. Europe is a mess. It's very hard to find any pattern there, but some places are better than others. But so the other question, we don't really, you know, this is very new. I was really surprised. I mean, we actually did make theoretically that prediction that patterns should matter, that should be a synergistic effect, that the hexagonal pattern matters more than, but I was really surprised that the dung counts were actually double in the hexagonal pattern experiment than in the other experiments. So clearly they prefer it. There was no, you know, uncertainty around the results. We're trying to look at the trails that the animals leave and see if we see anything interesting about, you know, in that network of trails, if that tells us something about, you know, how they move in between, and using camera traps. But I have no idea what we'll learn from that. I'm just excited that it's a result, an actual, it's there. Sure.
The regular patterns are more angles where they're exactly visible from all sorts of angles.
Yes. So could it be that with the regular pattern, the animals have a better vantage point because they can see more other animal, or they can hide better? Oh, that's a good question. But So I should have clarified this. In the system where we worked, yes, usually if there are trees on the termite mound, then of course they use it very much for cover. Where I showed you that we did the experimental manipulation, it's all grass. And so in those discs, it's actually just greener grass. They're not more hidden. They're not having a different vantage point. It's all flat and it's all grass. And all we see is that they really eat the grass there, and that they spend time there. So I don't think it has any anti-predator, any vigilance kind of, but I don't really know yet. There was a question there.
Yeah, I was just wondering with the slide showing that having termite mounds help with recovery of the system, like with increasing rainfall, does that assume that the benefits of the termite mounds have to persist through that dry down event?
Aha, excellent point, yes. So the question is, I showed you that termite mounds help vegetation come back in the system. Does that assume, though, that the termites persist through that period of no vegetation in the system, or what does it assume? It's a really important point. It does assume that the benefit of the mounds stays there. There is some work that shows, so we don't actually need the termites to be present. All we need is the accumulation of nutrients and the different soil, the different soil type that can allow water to infiltrate better. And so there's been some work where people have killed termites and kept them dead long enough to see how long do the benefits persist. And they do persist, surprisingly. You can have them there for 5-10 years, but obviously not indefinitely. So yeah, that's a benefit that's only there if the precipitation returns, fairly quickly. Not, if it takes 100 years, probably it wouldn't help anymore. But yes, that's a very, very good question. Yes?
So when you lay down your rules, you must include some length scales. And I guess I'm curious how the length scales that emerge from the simulations, are they easily rationalizable from the ones you created?
Yes. They are, I don't really know if you'll agree with that, but at least the way we tend to know how far termites forage and what their physiological limits are in terms of the distance that they can go. So we use that. We put a foraging distance. We put a maximum on how far they can get. They don't actually reach that maximum. So these distances actually emerge from the competition. So it's not that they get to as far as they can and then they stop because they can't go anymore, and that's how that you wouldn't get patterned that way. So this distance here is less than the distance that a termite can travel.
For the vegetation that was very close to the termite, you have these 10 centimeters length scales.
Ah, yeah.
You said you were surprised at that. So was that not a 10 centimeter length scale?
It was, of course. We put the vegetation to, it was determined by grasses, basically. What are the root lengths of grasses? What are the, right? So the whole inhibition and facilitation thing depends on how much they can grow locally and how big their root systems are and how does water infiltrate and so on and so forth. But yeah, absolutely. I wasn't surprised that, I was surprised that the pattern looked so clean in the model because the model is fairly stochastic. So at such a small scale, I expected a lot more noise. And then what surprised me was that I didn't think I had seen any of that pattern in the actual system. And it was like, oh, I may have been wrong here. But then we actually did find something that had the same level of noise and the same. Yeah, no, they're very much. We put them in there, at least some. Ranges for them that makes sense. Yes, Rob.
Yes, thanks so much. One of the appeal of the project is the convergence of scientific elegance with aesthetic elegance. And I was very struck in looking at some of the images of the mounds and the fairy circles. Some of them are reminiscent of certain parts of Aboriginal art, certain cloth in Indonesia, Mali, Mauritania, and is there any evidence of crossover between perception of ecological patterns and aesthetic traditions? And I'm interested in how the cultures, whether it's in Namibia, Mozambique, or Northwest Tanzania, or Australia, how these patterns register perhaps in stories or in cultural fields of perception. Now, obviously, they don't have or haven't historically had available to them the technologies of perception that allow you to distance a heightened
Yeah.
specialist patterns. But if you look at the mounds and that, you would think that the people living there would have some, that would enter into cultural consciousness.
Right. What a great question. Yes. There are multiple parts to it. And so this Namibia one is one of the easiest ones to have done that, actually, because it's pretty flat. They're pretty small. They're pretty close, and they are surrounded by hills. So if you go up a hill, you can actually see them. And it's not surprising, therefore, that that there are many legends and a lot of folklore surrounding these fairy circles. They're called fairy circles for a reason. They were, people have all sorts of explanations for them, from the breath of dragons to ancestor footsteps. So it's really a lot part of the culture locally. It's so much part of the culture and of thinking about this that when I submitted this paper, the editor wrote back and he said, "You mean they're not made by fairies?" So people, yes, we're rooting for fairy. I mean, I think the termites are a way better explanation, but but then there are the regions where it would be a lot harder to notice the regularity. And so I haven't really looked at. I would love to look at that question, but certainly people appreciate the importance of the termite mounds. So often in Kenya, we find people just tear down the termite mound, take the soil, and spread it over their crops because it's so nutritious, right? So they are certainly aware that there's something good is going on, but perhaps they should leave them alone because this is saying that it's a good thing, for termites to be there. But yeah.
Take one more question.
Yeah.
I'm just struck with the similarity between the termites as being the termite toads as being a type of civilization. Look at it that way. And I'm just curious, is there any opportunity that you see for us to learn from what is going on in the natural systems and bring back to our own civilizations, perhaps areas where we're becoming too civilized? Is there a balance that we need to meet between civilization and nature?
Oh, a lot of my work is, so I started work in biology by asking questions about humans and decided that they were, and that it would be better to focus on something else. And so I went to ants, and then, but often I think back, and so especially in this kind of thing where we can analyze, like Mayank asked, we can analyze man-made patterns and natural emerging patterns. Why is it that we're so obsessed with the 90-degree angles, and why is it that nature often produces these hexagonal patterns? And is it that nature has come up with a much more robust solution to various stressors? So that's one of the questions that we are trying to think about. I don't know why we're doing it like that, maybe for ease of something. Maybe it would be very hard to navigate hexagonal patterns, but there are these, you can go back to, if you go to pre-Columbian, so if you go back to agricultural fields from the pre-Columbian period in Latin America, you can find still their crops were arranged very much in 90-degree angles. And then there are areas where termites and other things have taken over and they've turned it into a hexagonal pattern, and so it's really quite, I find it quite fascinating. In terms of, the fighting and other things, that's probably we shouldn't do what the termites are doing, but yeah, that's part of the point, right? Can we learn from nature? And we often can, right? And in trying to engineer solutions that would be good for us too.
Let's thank Corina again. Great. Yeah, we could have stayed for another half an hour at least.